And the first group of survivors is the Dilworth class action group. Welcome back, Ms. Reid.
Madam Chair, Commissioners, ko Rachel Reid, tōku ingoa. No taumaki makoro, aho, ki Ohinarau, te Munga, ki tamaki, ki te awa. I appear along with Ali Van Amers and Carl van der Plas, who you met earlier, for the Dilworth Class Action Group. For those who need the assistance of a description, I am a 51-year-old woman, and I would like to think that I am taller than I am, at 5'7.5". I am Pakeha, and I wear a black dress with a blue jacket and glasses. I have mousy blonde shoulder-length hair.
Just bring your microphone a little bit closer.
Thank you. In contrast, Ms. Van Amers is a 37-year-old Pakeha woman. She's 5'8", with blonde hair tied in a bun. She's wearing a dark navy suit and a light blue and pink blouse, which actually means, in summary, she is younger, taller, slimmer, and prettier than me. Mr. van der Plas opened to you on Wednesday with the whakatauki, hei waka eke noa. We are all in this boat together. We have filed written submissions of the closing address for the Commissioners, and you should also have that in Word and hard copy form. We won't be able to address in the time we have allocated all parts of that closing address, so we do ask you for your indulgence to only take highlights from it or parts of it and skip through that closing address. But it was important for us to be able to do that in full in writing to the Commissioners.
And may I thank you and your team for doing that. They are very comprehensive. We only received them recently, so we haven't been through them, but you can be assured that we will be reading them carefully, and again, they will be on the website for others to read. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In this closing address for the Dilworth Class Action Group, we addressed two key issues. First, Dilworth's response to abuse at the time, and secondly, its more recent redress response. It is intended, with your indulgence, to split this closing address between myself and Ms. Van Amers, and the reason for that is important. The work involved in this Dilworth Class Action Group has been immense for all of us involved, and we are all working. I'm so sorry, I'm normally far too loud rather than far too quiet.
And maybe a little far too fast as well. So,
of course.
All right,
I will try and slow down.
Thank
you.
Fine.
It has been immense, the work for all of us involved, and as the Commissioners are aware, we are, with pride, working pro bono for the survivors of Dilworth. But it is important for the huge contribution of each member of this team is recognised in a small way, and for Ms. Van Amers, that is in presenting part of this closing address to the Commissioners. So with that indulgence, if I could turn to Ms. Van Amers for the first part of that closing address.
Certainly.
Thank you. In opening, we questioned whether, in their approaches to redress and abuse, Dilworth and the Anglican Church have joined survivors in their waka, working together in partnership, honouring the principles of shared values, recognition and mutual respect. Now is not the time for us to address the Anglican Church's response. Discussions between our group and the Church are still ongoing and in early stages. However, the class action group was heartened by the insight shown by the witnesses for the Church during their evidence. We encourage the Church to continue in this way and maintain that approach in its discussions with us going forward. Unfortunately, our experience with Dilworth has not been the same. Having heard accounts of survivors across many decades and now having heard the evidence from the school did not join with survivors at the time complaints were made, and nor has it now. Regrettably, our experience with Dilworth is not a redress success story. At least it isn't yet. Overall, the impression we have got is that the school is more concerned about the Dilworth legacy, or perhaps the perception it has of that legacy, rather than the reality of students' experiences and the well-being of individual survivors. Certainly, that is the way that their actions in recent times have been perceived by the survivors that we represent. I will address our submissions on Dilworth's response to complaints of abuse as they were made. All Dilworth witnesses acknowledged that the school's responses were inadequate, at least until 2018. Plainly, that was the case. While Dr. Wilton and Mr. Firth appear to accept that had they known then what they know now, they would have acted differently, they both attempted to justify and excuse their own and the school's failings. Listening to those aspects of their evidence was extremely difficult, so long as these men refused to accept that they not only could, but should have done better for survivors. Their apologies ring hollow. For any apology to be meaningful, it must include an understanding of and admission of the wrongdoing, but we have heard neither. In considering Dilworth's responses to complaints, 4 key themes emerged from the evidence: the sheer number of complaints and the number of offenders, Dilworth's lack of understanding of sexual abuse, the school's failure to properly investigate allegations, and the school's extremely poor treatment of complainants. I will address each of these themes briefly in turn. To be absolutely clear, nothing that has come out over the last few days establishes that there was no cover-up or provides any comfort the complaints were properly dealt with when made. As the Commission is no doubt aware, Mr. Wilton and Mr. Firth's evidence is by no means a comprehensive account of all of the complaints that were made to the school over the years. Many other complaints were made but were not believed and were not elevated to the board. Even if we accept the school's evidence at face value, allegations of sexual abuse were not comparatively rare, as was suggested. They were endemic. When Dr. Wilton started at the school, the first chaplain had just been moved on for sexual offending. During his 18 years as headmaster, he received 5 complaints about 5 different staff members. 2 more staff members were complained about after he left. That's 7 known offenders. We now know that there were at least 12. This was a very small, intimate school. It consistently had sexual offenders operating at it over 4 decades. For most of that period, there were multiple offenders operating at any one time. Many boys were abused, not by one, but by multiple offenders. The unavoidable conclusion is that there was something in the culture of the school that allowed the abuse to occur in the first place and then to continue. Indeed, at his sentencing, Ian Wilson referred to being introduced to the degenerative behaviour when he first arrived at the school in the 1970s. The suggestion was that this was learned behaviour that was accepted amongst the staff. He was promoted to assistant principal, relied on by Dr. Wilton, and remained at the school until he was convicted for sexual offending in 1997. Dr. Wilton and Mr. Firth's inability to see that the incidents that were reported to them were serious demonstrates that the school has historically lacked knowledge and understanding of sexual abuse, the dynamics of that abuse, key concepts like consent and grooming. I'll just briefly touch on 2 examples. Looking at the first chaplain, this man was in a position of special power and influence. He was charged with the pastoral care and spiritual guidance of students. He had been accused of inappropriately touching numerous boys, many of them very young and all of them extremely vulnerable. It is difficult to envisage a world in which it was appropriate for the school to simply move him on without reporting him to the police. Leonard Cave. In 1981, a boy reported that Mr. Cave had plied him with alcohol in a social setting and inappropriately touched him. Dr. Wilton and Mr. Firth sought to minimise this incident by focusing on the supply of alcohol. Dr. Wilton gave Mr. Cave a glowing reference so he could get another job in education. He says that is what the survivor wanted. Even if that's true, and I'm not convinced that it is, the survivor was a young boy who had recently been traumatised. Dilworth was a powerful institution. It had a duty to protect vulnerable children. Because it failed to do so, Mr. Cave went on to offend at another school. If Dilworth did not know the full scope and scale of the abuse occurring within its walls, well, that's because it chose not to. On the school's own evidence, each time it received a complaint, it failed to properly investigate the details of the abuse that occurred. whether any other boys had been abused by the same offender, whether any other staff members had been offending in similar manners, what factors had enabled the offenders to perpetrate the abuse, or what could have been done to prevent similar incidents from occurring in the future. Any investigations that were carried out were undertaken by the school itself and cursory at best. The chances of the scale of the abuse coming to light were reduced by the school's own actions in proactively seeking name suppression when offenders were prosecuted and convicted for their crimes. Had it not done so, many other survivors would have known that they were not alone. They might have come forward. Instead, the school sought to and did maintain a culture of silence into the 2000s. If the school had undertaken adequate investigations, reported incidents to the police, or not sought name suppression, the full scale of the abuse by each offender could have been discovered and dealt with at the time. Offenders would not have been able to simply move on and continue offending against children. Survivors could have shared their stories and experiences earlier and received support and redress decades ago. Much trauma and suffering could have been avoided. Instead, the school left it until 2017, 40 years after the first chaplain's offending came to light, to start looking into whether the school was in fact a safe environment. It took the courage of survivors in Operation Beverly for the abuse to be unearthed and confronted. It took even longer still, with the class action group's intervention, for the school to finally commission an inquiry and establish a redress program. Lastly, Dilworth's treatment of complainants has been, quite frankly, disgraceful. We heard yesterday about how long it takes survivors of sexual abuse to come forward, and it is often decades. However, many boys bravely reported abuse at the time that it occurred. Sadly, many of them were not believed, and none of them were taken care of, as they should have been. Strikingly, there is no evidence that any of the survivors who reported abuse to the school were provided with any form of pastoral care or support. Mr. Firth said that the board directed Mr. Parr to ensure that the first chaplain's victims received counselling. However, as he accepted, nothing was done to identify any other victims. Whatever Mr. Parr was told to do, or in fact did, none of the survivors who were identified received any support of any kind. The school's treatment of survivors is a product of the attitudes of those in power, the board and the headmasters. Despite having handled sexual abuse cases as counsel and having been involved in the Centrepoint proceeding, Mr. Firth's attitude to survivors has been callous in the extreme. His letter to Francis Joychild KC was chilling. If that was his position then, surely it was his position in the decades prior, and still is. Even in his statement, Mr. Firth criticised Mr. Harding for media statements suggesting that Dilworth had harboured known offenders. He referred to Mr. Harding as mischievous. That characterisation of a survivor speaking out against abuse and those who allowed it to occur is completely unacceptable. It is symptomatic of a culture of disbelieving and disrespecting survivors. Mr. Firth accepted that his attitude reflected his age and his life view. Unfortunately, the board was made up exclusively of older, Pākehā men with commercial backgrounds for the entire duration during which the complaints were received. In these circumstances, it is no wonder that the school's approach to complainants was so harsh. Mr. Snodgrass recorded the school having much the same attitude in 2018, worried about money. The demographic of the board has remained largely the same. In summary, Dilworth's past responses to complaints of abuse have been woefully inadequate, to put it lightly. The school failed survivors and their families. The consequent harm has been immense, and it continues today. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Hammond. Thank you, Ms. Hammond.
Thank you, Commissioners. Now turning to the current redress program, and this is from paragraph 43 of the closing address, although I won't follow exactly along for time purposes. Turning to that response, and in particular the independent inquiry, the redress program and the listening service, there are 3 areas we wish the Commission to consider. The first, which is important, is the process by way redress was reached and what that says. Second is the outcome of the redress process. And the third is the current culture of the school as it relates to abuse and redress. The last point is important because culture drives behaviour and institutional culture determines whether redress is truly restorative. Dilworth's process and the eventual response demonstrates the culture of the board now. Having heard that evidence, one would be forgiven for thinking that the process by way redress was reached was a collaborative and constructive one, and it was unfortunately not. As Mr. van der Plas noted in our opening address, the process was akin to a commercial negotiation, and there was an absence of genuine recognition, mutual respect, and partnership. As one of our clients described it, it was a game of legal tennis with no regard to the trauma they have suffered and the impact that that approach would have. It is not possible within this address to comprehensively talk through the process by which redress was reached today. Because of that, our marks are just brief. But in summary of a few key points of the process, first of all, prior to our client's complaint to the Human Rights Commission being filed, Dilworth had not apologised for its role in the abuse, nor had it offered or even indicated that it wished to engage in redress. On filing of the complaint, we wrote to Dilworth inviting them to work with us on redress, and in particular the establishment of an independent inquiry and an independent process for administering comprehensive redress. Dilworth responded in a legalistic fashion, refused to engage in discussion immediately about redress, and rejected dealing with us on a class action basis. The class action was obviously required to address the power imbalance for survivors. And it is an avenue where we are genuinely committed to survivors getting full redress in a manner that does not provide further trauma to them. And that was the time, and we were the people to engage with. And of course there are other survivor groups too. But we have over 130 registered survivors of Dilworth in our class action. Despite Mr. Snodgrass' suggestion that the board had been exploring an inquiry since 2018, that Dilworth initially refused our request and calls for a commission of independent inquiry, noting that it was unnecessary because this commission would be considering abuse at the school. At that point, of course, the constraints that would be on the commission were known. We conducted several detailed survivor surveys which we provided to Dilworth, and at no point have the Trust Board themselves met with us or our clients despite requests. Still to this day, Mr. Snodgrass has not met us, and when I last looked, was not in attendance today to be heard, and that physical presence or absence is noted. Witnesses for the Anglican Church also noted that Dilworth's approach was one of consultation, not collaboration. And that is where the distinction lies, and that is crucial for survivors to feel that they are brought back into the fold, that they are listened to, that they lead what they need, and the school hears what they need, and that has not occurred. When Ms. Anderson asked Mr. Snodgrass about the distinction between consultation and collaboration with survivors in the redress program, he rightfully acknowledged that he could have done better. And when pressed, he provided two explanations for why that wasn't done, The first being one of timing, and the second being one of a lack of understanding of abuse and how to respond to it. Well, if they had come on board our waka, they may have gained that understanding and committed to that collaborative process. We suggest and submit that the Commission should take a very critical view of this. Our timeliness. Our discussions with Dilworth occurred over nearly a year rather than the 4 months suggested. Over 100 communications were sent between the parties. Timeliness was simply not an issue. There was time to adequately collaborate and bring us on board. This was a cultural response, and a cultural response driven by what had been the past of Dilworth and what Dilworth does. Just segueing a moment away from the closing address, primarily Dilworth is a large commercial organisation set up by the will, but primarily manages property and has a school. If you look for a moment at the assets of Dilworth and the limb of the school and the constitution of the board, you will see that it is a commercial entity and driven by commercial and property interests. And there is a commitment, of course, to the school, which has wonderful aims, should they be able to complete it. But primarily, that commercial approach has infected the process of redress, meaning it is not collaborative, it is commercial. The reality of it was that it was a commercial negotiation where Dilworth was focused on dismissing our clients' complaints and moving through the process quickly so that they could say they offered redress in a manner without understanding the needs of survivors. It meant that in doing so they were taking the view of limiting their own financial exposure, pursuing their own interests rather than engaging with survivors with recognition and mutual respect. And I do underline the word respect in a collaborative approach, and that further proliferated the power imbalance between Dilworth and the survivors, and very sadly through this process has caused them further trauma because they're not listened to. Turning to the outcome of the redress program, and I do appreciate we have been over time, and I will be as quick as I can, but it is important to address this briefly if I could. We do acknowledge at the outset there has been progress despite the process by which it was reached. It was hard reached, but we have had progress from where we started from. And the independent inquiry has our utmost support, and survivors have had positive engagement with the inquiry heads. The redress program that is now in effect is very different to what it started out to have been. Many of the changes we have suggested have been accepted. However, there are fundamental issues that remain, and we can't set them all out in the time that we have, but just in terms of an insight into what those are that remain, because they are quite fundamental. The first, and I have this at paragraph 58A of the closing address, is the issue of boy-on-boy abuse. Dilworth did not initially include that at all within the redress program. We finally, after consultation, got to the point where the terms were extended to the extent set out in subparagraph 6. I'll read that briefly. It includes sexual abuse by another student where a Dilworth representative failed to take reasonable steps to protect against the potential for that abuse, or where the sexual abuse was encouraged or permitted by a Dilworth representative. The message is that boys who were sexually abused at Dilworth by another student may or may not get redress depending on the evidence that they'll be able to present as to whether a representative should have known for the potential of the abuse and done something about it. They seek to distinguish between boys who were sexually abused under their watch. That is not redress for all survivors of sexual abuse at Dilworth. It is still carving out survivors from obtaining redress. There are still concerns about the parallel process running in tandem and how survivors will engage and how much they will be required to engage with one or both. It was interesting to hear Mr. Barker address that there has been a terms of reference or a protocol between the inquiry and the redress program. That was the first we had heard of it. We have not seen it. We have not been able to comment on it. No consultation, no collaboration with us. In terms of the cap, survivors saw this as Dilworth, the entity that allowed their abuse to occur, to be unilaterally determining the price for it. Mr. Snodgrass says they had to have a cap, and we reject that. If they wished to establish a cap because of their trust deed, they could have sought advice and a recommendation from the redress panel, having heard the outcome of the inquiry, and then set a cap. But at present, setting a cap now before the outcome of the inquiry means they do not know the facts on which it is based. They do not know what they are providing redress for. It is illusory, and it is simply done to limit the financial obligation of the school so that they can commercially, as they do, put a number on it.
Ms. Reid, had the survivors group heard of the responses to our questions the other day about when we drilled down as to what was available to survivors in terms of being able to put a claim in now, that it could be revisited later, etc. Was your group aware of that before this hearing?
We are aware of the terms. Now, the terms themselves are not wonderfully clear because the survivor still has to sign in full and final settlement if they receive redress. So, and then the redress panel may, should it wish, revisit that redress after the outcome of the inquiry. If we just sit back and think about that process for a moment and how that practically may occur. The inquiry comes out after a survivor has got redress. The survivor may never see the outcome of the inquiry or realise that parts of it indicate that their redress should have been greater. The redress panel may well not go back to the inquiry, review every part of it, review all redress they've already ordered, and determine whether or not that should be rectified based on the findings, or even how those findings may impact the position if the survivor had known that. So there are real difficulties in that type of process, which in our view should have been avoided. And there were other ways to deal with it. For example, if a survivor was in great need, there could have been a preliminary payment to meet that need, with redress determined later, when the outcome of the inquiry is known, without a survivor then having to find an inquiry report, determine whether or not it relates to them, put their hand up and go through the process again of reassessment. So there are other avenues, other ways that it would have met that initial concern, and that is not what has occurred, and in my submission is not in the best interests of survivors.
Is there an ongoing relationship and communication in relation to this scheme? And there was indications from, I think, Mr. Snodgrass that we were open to further discussions. Evolving, I think, was a word that was used quite a lot. Is the action group involved in that, quote, evolution?
Standing here right now, no, I have not heard of an evolution or been invited on behalf of the Dilworth Class Action Group to evolve the program. We proactively still pursue these issues. with the resources that we have, but no, certainly not. I have not seen an invitation.
So
from
in a
the Trust
nutshell,
Board.
what the action group is seeking is the collaborative approach that you referred to at the beginning.
That's right, and our message today that we want to send, and that can probably take me to my conclusion quite nicely, which should give some comfort on timing too. I'm sorry, Madam Chair. But the message today is that it is not too late. We
Yes.
remain here ready, willing and able, as we always have been, to do the best for survivors of Dilworth. And Dilworth can come to us. Dilworth can come on our waka and do the right thing by them. And it is about determining first what the right thing is to do before then working out the legal technicality of how you achieve that. So our message to the board, and I do hope that they are listening online, even though not physically present, that they should come to us and change that approach and do the right thing by survivors now, rather than barrelling on with a redress program that is deficient, that does not meet their needs when they have been told it does not meet their needs. He waka, eke noa.
Thank you, Ms Reid, and I think it's noted, it should be noted that Mr Barker for the Trust is in the room,
He is indeed.
and I'm sure ears wide open.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair, but the point is the
Yes.
message it
It's
sends.
it's the actual representatives who are missing.
And it's the dismissal of the survivor voice and not being present to hear it and not giving it that level of respect to do so. They should be in the room.
Well,
Thank you.
may I thank you sincerely, Ms Reid, and your team. It is not overlooked that you are doing this pro bono, and I think the survivors can be very grateful for that work that you are doing. I just want to thank you on behalf of the Commission for your cooperation with us. Again, it's a lot of work. We appreciate that, and we are very grateful that we've had the responses to our questions, the submissions and all the rest of it. But can I just say again, grateful to the survivors for their presence through the last few days, for the petition that they gave up to us. It was a very valuable document which we are taking seriously. And just to know, as for everybody else, that the door is not closed, although this hearing is over, the door is not closed to survivors, and we welcome their approach as well.
And thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Ms Reid.
Just on Mr Snodgrass's availability, because I wouldn't want that to be seen as any disrespect to the Commission or indeed, of course, the survivors.
Yes, Mr
This
Barker.
hearing was originally, of course, going to be on Friday.
Yes.
We got changed. It was he lives in Gisborne. It was very difficult for him to get up for the Wednesday and Thursday, which he was able to do. But we didn't know that the class action group wasn't closing until about actually mid-afternoon yesterday.
Right.
So he wasn't able to, A, flights were a difficulty, but B, just wasn't able to change his work commitments he had for today. So it is an apology, but I wouldn't want it to be seen as in any way a disrespect to the work that's been done on.
Thank you, Mr Barker.